he bobbed up like an apple, like a rosy-cheeked apple 2 falls ago.
It's true.
And he said, I'm here hunting apples. He said, oh, please come back.
And I have.
And you've been coming back, but now finally you come back and you get to sit down with our notebooks. Joyfully.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Turley. I live down in Portland. I do a variety of apple-related things. I help identify apples. I forage fruit for cider makers, too, in the state. So I'm looking for usually seedling fruit that's good for cider making. I run a cider club, and I'm now, as of tomorrow morning, an author. So I put together a book called Practical Pomology. I have cards of it. I don't have physical copies because it's just going on sale tomorrow, so a pre-order. And this has been about a 10-year process in making this book. The basic principle was when I started getting into apple identification, I very quickly realized there was no kind of easy-to-use source to teach you how to do it. So you have probably less than 10 people in the country who are really good at it, maybe 5 in the country who could do it well. And they've only developed that skill by studying old pomological texts from the late 1800s, early 1900s, where there was this big publishing boom by universities about describing apples anatomically in order to differentiate them, and then also kind of trying to provide insights into what made different apples different. And the problem with that is, one, a lot of those books didn't actually use the same terminology the same way. So maybe the same words appeared, but they might have meant something slightly different. And also, none of them are complete. So there's no person. Basically, these were all written by professional fruit studiers to each other. So no one was like, oh, we should write this for the everyday person to look at and understand what we're talking about. So no text historically has kind of put everything in one place. And so the book is an attempt to do that, and then to make it practical and useful to actually learn how to do this skill. And I will go through, in a sense, the process the book leads you through in terms of identifying apples. So, and this always strikes a lot of people as strange, but when you start with identifying apples, you actually start with trees. So one of the wonderful things about apples is they're not true to seed, meaning if I took a seed from that apple and planted it, I would not get that apple. I would get a unique apple that has never existed before and will never exist again by planting a different seed. Every seed in that apple is a unique potential tree and fruit. So that means that if something is a seedling, that's the term for something grown from seed, it is unique and is therefore unidentifiable. The only things that are identifiable are trees that people grafted. So people who took a cutting of an existing tree they liked and spliced it onto another apple tree, and from that graft union up grew the apple they wanted. And so that's how you got to have, let's say Macintosh. So Macintosh was first found in, I think, about 1760 in Quebec, and someone found it, was like, I like this apple, and they cut off little pieces of wood called scions, and they share it with their friends, and their friends share it with their friends, and friends and friends and friends and friends, and now there are probably several 100,000 Macintosh trees, which are all clones of the original 1750 Macintosh tree. They're genetically identical, but only from that kind of graft union up, and below something called rootstock that is chosen usually for vigor or some other purpose. So what this means, practically speaking, in terms of identification, is if you have a seedling, you cannot identify it because it's unique. If you have a grafted tree, you can identify it. So the key kind of first question is, am I looking at a grafted tree or am I looking at a seed? And how to figure that out can be a little hard, but there are some just general rules. So one is, you have to realize that if it's a grafted tree, a human put it there on purpose. So you have to think like a human if you're looking for grafted trees. So where would you put a tree? Would you put it in a ditch? Would you put it next to the ocean? Would you put it, coming out of a cellar hole? Not usually. You would probably put it out somewhere where you feel like it's going to get good light and have nice irrigation and kind of drainage and also going to probably put them in some organized pattern. So traditionally that meant about spreading them out about 25 feet apart, because apple trees get big, and laying them on a grid. So that would be kind of how a human would make an orchard. How nature makes an orchard is nature doesn't really give a shit, and apple seeds get planted everywhere, and they pop up everywhere. By the ocean, sides of fields, in a stone wall, the cellar hole, as I said. They just come up. So the first thing you actually think about is the apple tree in a logical place where a human would have cultivated this tree? And if the answer is no, then most likely it's a seedling. If it's really old and it's very pretty and the fruit's tasty, it's probably just a seedling. So that's kind of step one. Step two is looking at the tree itself. So that graft signwood rootstock thing I was talking about can leave a visible scar on a tree called a graft line. And so here are some examples of how you might see that. Now, generally speaking, people grafted in two locations on a tree. One is they would graft when the tree was very young, like a sapling. And if the tree is now grown older, that graft line might be very low to the ground. Might even be covered up. But it would appear kind of like a little bulbous area, or kind of like a scarring tissue that goes around the entire tree. So this would be people who took a signwood, took like a 1 or 2 year old other tree, and grafted them together. The other thing people did a lot was they would take an existing tree, and then about a chest height, they would cut off the top and put inside. And that's called top working. It's a way to kind of get fruit quicker, because you have an established tree and all this energy is going into your new scion. And so you often see graft unions about chest height. So it's kind of like at the ground, chest height. Now, of course, trees grow, and when they grow, they get bigger and they go higher. So this is not a perfect thing. If the tree, let's say, was grafted, but then no one took care of it for, it's not uncommon to be 60, 70, 80 years, it could have just grown up. And so maybe the graft line is at your head or somewhere even higher. So sometimes you actually see the graft union. I would say on older trees, you usually don't see it. It's just hard to see. If the tree's really old, it kind of, grows around that scarring tissue, and it's not really visible. So there are some little clues. One is looking at differences in vigor in a tree. So it could be, remember, when you're grafting, there's literally two different types of trees, or two different types of apples on top of each other. So one might be more vigorous than the other. So you might see like a thinner trunk, and then kind of like an expansion, and it gets bigger. And you can see the inverse of that. So you can see that the rootstock part of it is growing very vigorously, and then it narrows and tapers. And so that's a way to see, okay, I can't see the graft line. I mean, these are actually very visible. That's what they look like. But even if you didn't see that, you could see something changed in the tree. And that's not a normal feature of like a seedling tree. So the other kind of last thing to be aware of is really fun people who like grafting would potentially do multiple grafts in the same tree. So this would be an example of that. So they've cut off 3 existing branches and then basically grafted on maybe the same variety 3 times, or if they're really wacky, 3 different varieties. Old timers didn't really do that, but newfangled people do because it's fun. So you might see this as well. You might see graft unions kind of along the branches of the tree. Any questions so far? Yeah.
So, historically, when people were planting orchards, were they always grafting? Were they like, 1700?
Definitely not. So going way back, what people had was seeds. So when people came here from Europe and established settlements, they were bringing seeds of their favorite apples, and they were planting those seeds. And they were just seeing what sprouted up. And if it was really hard, they might store it. If it was really tart, they might make it into vinegar. If it tasted good fresh, they would eat it. They would try to cook with it. They just try to make their apples work for them. But no, they were usually not grafting. Fast forward to probably about 1850 and afterwards, people are more conscientiously choosing varieties to grow. And especially in Maine, there were pomological exhibitions you could go to and try different apples. And like, ooh, that's a good one. I like this Tolman Sweet. I like this McIntosh. Go home and then graft that on to whatever you had. But no, you're right. The really kind of, from a kind of identification historical perspective, you have to remember that every first tree of its kind is a seedling. So the first McIntosh was a seedling. There'd be no graft line because that tree grew from seed. So in terms of identification, it could be, especially if you're looking for something that, for example, let's say we knew an apple was only really grown in Maine, maybe only in a little area. The original tree might still be there. It lived to be about 150-ish, a little bit older, can sometimes happen. And so there'd be no graft line, but yeah, you have discovered the original tree. But yeah, certainly over time, grafting became a much more kind of common practice of your homestead to be able to do. And then you would, let's say you just have this apple you couldn't do anything with, you would, switch that over to something you like.
What is it about the genetics of apples that doesn't let you do it from seed?
So apples are diploids like us, so they get genetics from their mother and father. In the case of an apple, it's their kind of tree parent or fruit parent and the pollen parent. And the number of alleles in apples is about 2 times as many as in humans. So much like you might be like your parents but not identical to your parents, so not 50-50 of your parents somehow, apples, just by their genetic makeup, are just so much more diverse. So the difference you get between, I could plant this little red apple and I could legitimately get this apple, just because these are the genes that express when I plant the seed. So there's a lot more genetic material to lead to this diversity. And it's a survival mechanism. It just means that there's more possibilities for the tree for the apple to survive given its environment with more genetic diversity. Yeah.
There are some that come closer to the parent varieties.
Yeah.
Duchess seems to have such a slight around the Duchess.
Yeah, so there's 2 that are known to be closer, but still not identical. And we've been doing a lot of genetic testing and coming out that even things that we know are seedlings of Duchess of Oldenburg, which is a good example of this kind of more true to seed, they are still unique. And there's another one in the southeast United States called Nickajack, has a similar reputation of like, you plant Nickajack seed and you get something Nickajacky and not just like random. But they are still different, but you're right, if you go to like far northern Maine, like up near like Presque Isle and Aroostook County, you'll see a lot of apples that look like Duchess. They're definitely seedlings of Duchess, and they're kind of stripy and oblate, kind of flat. But if we tested them, they would be unique. But yeah, so it is true that some varieties seem to be honed a little bit closer to their parents than others. But it's a pretty rare trait, actually. Those are the only 2 I know of that have that reputation in the entire United States.
So in fact, apples do fall far from the tree.
They fall very far from the tree. Yeah. No, it's a good clarification. Which also means then that, to switch gears slightly, this means that apple breeding is kind of a crapshoot. Because, so when universities, for example, breed honeycrisp, they plant tens of thousands of apple seeds. And they just wait for something to arise, and they're like, oh, that one got sick. They wipe it out. Oh, that one, the fruit is not red enough. Kill that. And they literally go through this process of eradicating, 9,000 trees to arrive at honeycrisp. Because they can't be like, ooh, we're just going to put this crunchy apple and this red apple together, and they're going to, get together and make a beautiful tasting apple.
Are there folks outside of universities who are working on genetic development more in sort of a production context?
Yeah, there's a couple kind of groups doing this. So one large market driver of apples that did not exist, let's say, 10 years ago is actually cider making. So there are a couple programs who are purposely breeding for cider characteristics. Michigan State University is doing it. Washington State University is doing it. As they're literally planning not for honeycrisp, but for like the most bitter apple you can think Part of and it is in fact Washington State University that does a lot of the genetic testing. And part of the genetic testing is to do better breeding. So they've created a kind of genome of the apple. What that allows them to do then is rather than waiting 2 years, 3 years for fruit from this, again, one of those 10,000 trees, they simply test the leaves of the DNA and like, oh, we know that, we don't want that one. Like maybe it's again susceptible to something or it won't be crunchy. It doesn't have the super crunchy gene that Honeycrisp has, which there is a super crunchy gene. And they're like, nope, done. So the genetic studying actually helps reinforce kind of the breeding. There are also people who are just legit breeding for fun. And take 2 apples they like that they find to be tasty and they add some pollen and they just see what happens. And I will say it actually turns out better than one would think. It's not such a crapshoot that, for every 100 times you get one good one, I'd say it's like 20 to 1 or 10 to 1. But no, definitely the kind of priorities have shifted a lot. All right, can you, yes, I'll tell you where to stop. Great, this is a great place to stop. All right, so, as I said, grafted trees, humans are grafting, they're putting them in a place that makes sense, and there might be physical characteristics of the tree itself you can actually see that tell you it's grafted. But I would say honestly, to those 2 things, context is always more important. Because, again, once trees get old, you can't always see these physical clues on the tree anymore. So then, kind of the question becomes, what other ways can you see whether something is grafted? So one, for example, that's a good example of kind of what a grafting unit might look like. Here's another example. The tree itself has 2 different fruit. So old untended trees, that rootstock that was originally selected just to provide a base for the scion wood, or the scion wood variety to grow, might shoot up a branch, and it'll grow that fruit. So you can actually look at a tree and go, well, the fruit up here and the fruit down here are different. Well, then it's a grafted tree. That's not something a tree normally does. Sometimes you have to be kind of clever looking for physical clues. So trees can and do kind of fall over and reroot. And so sometimes the tree itself, like, oh, that's a young tree, like that's a seedling, and then like you look like 5 feet down the road, like, oh, that might be a graft line. So it fell over. The next kind of classification of trees, which at least suggests human intervention, it doesn't necessarily mean it's grafted, but at least it means someone tended to it. So maybe they planted the seed or it's grafted, is signs of cultivation. So generally speaking, it is a pain in the ass to pick trees that have fruit very high in the sky. So humans tend to want to spread out the canopy of the tree horizontally to make it more accessible. So these shapes are signs of cultivation. So people purposely cutting off branches that go straight up and trying to get things to go horizontal so it's accessible, they can actually access the fruit. Now, again, this would not tell you it's grafted, but at least would tell you that someone likely took care of this. This is not a normal, I'll get to it in a second, but this is not a normal shape of an apple tree in the wild. And making this more confusing is apple trees often shoot up what are called water spreads. Those are these vertical, very young branches. I mean, they'll turn to branches, usually on the interior of the tree. So they can look a little scraggly and wild, but you're kind of looking for this shape, this kind of like vase-like U kind of shape, as indications of at least cultivation. And again, that's not be all and end all in terms of grafting, but it's helpful. The other thing is, you can imagine a tree that was like this, but then was neglected. And so what you would see there is a trunk of a tree that has clear kind of missing branches that were horizontal, and then maybe now a high canopy. Go to the next one. All right, seedlings. These are seedlings. So seedlings, again, as I said, you're not looking at it from a human perspective. You're kind of looking at it from an anti-human, anti-chaotic perspective. So what apples need to grow, apple trees need to grow is light and some type of nutrients. And apple trees are happiest not competing. They cannot compete with like hardwood trees. So they need to be in a place that has light, and so they might lean up to get it, which is this shape. You'll see a lot for seedling apple trees. Or again, they might be in a field where they get it fine. Other telltale signs. A tree that just goes straight up. So apple trees show what's called atypical dominance, which means their natural pattern of growth is just up. So if you just see an apple tree that goes up and there's no horizontal branches and doesn't look like anyone pruned it, that's probably a seedling. Another thing, classic sign of a seedling is multiple trunks. That is not something that comes out of graft unless, I mean, in very rare situations there might be something way deep down that's the graft, but usually that's an indication it's a seedling. Another thing you might see is the trunk of an old dead tree and a lot of kind of new saplings coming around it. Again, those might be seedlings of it. In fact, might be seedlings of that dead tree.
Could they also be the root shoots?
They can if they're still connected to that trunk, absolutely. Yes. And again, how deep it might grow, you've got to kind of investigate. What's important to realize about seedling trees is they can be really big and cool, and they can be really tiny. And so it's kind of like, oh, it's old doesn't mean it's not a seedling. It just means it's old. They could be growing happily for 150 years, just like any other tree, and be humongous, or they may be really tiny. Oftentimes, the size depends on where it is, what nutrients it has. So you might see like a tree next to the ocean looks really small, and that may be a very old tree. The last one. All right, so more seedlings, and this is just kind of again this context idea. So apple tree near the ocean, that's a seedling. No one does that. Apple tree kind of coming out of the foundation of the house, seedling. Apple tree next to a mailbox, seedling. Also a pretty protected seedling because probably there's like some rail here, and the snow plows that hit it, so that's why it's grown there. Apple tree kind of like sandwiched between two buildings, seedling. Sometimes in really old seedlings, they actually kind of fuse, which is pretty cool. So this, at some point in its life, this is an illustration of an apple tree actually up in Presque Isle. What could have been multiple trunks kind of grow together into a kind of unified trunk. And so it can kind of look like an old tree that maybe you're like, oh, maybe that's grafted. But if you look closely, you might notice that actually like it was separate trees that kind of grew together, or separate trunks that grew together. And this is what some cool seedlings look like. Because again, they can look like cool wizened trees, just like a grafted tree. All right. So any questions about that part, this grafted tree part? Yeah.
Those where they grow together, what would that fruit then look like?
So it would all be the same. So yeah, so when you see a multi-trunk tree, there is a common root system to that.
Oh, okay.
It's just that there's no grafting inside it. Yeah, so it is the same tree. Apple trees need a bit of distance, even growing kind of up in the field. They're going to try to separate out by at least, just so they don't shade each other out usually. Or rather, if there's one that's already established, it's going to shade out any new tree. So to get the light it needs, any other tree would have to be at least like 5, 8, 10 feet away in order to survive. All right. So you have looked at your tree and you're like, okay, it's a grafted tree. I am sure it's grafted. Again, maybe it's a context clue. You see, a bunch of trees in a row, in a straight line. That's a good context clue. Or even if they're not existing trees in a straight line, you see some stumps and you're like, cool, yeah, like that makes sense. Or again, like a large grid. Or you see graft union, or the vigor looks different. Now the next question becomes, how the hell do you identify these things? And what's important to realize is that identifying apples, now that you have a grafted tree, requires quite a bit of investigating about the fruit itself. And what I advise, if you're ever trying to identify a fruit, is first of all, you want to go to a tree that hopefully has a lot of fruit. And you want to pick 10 that kind of look, as far as you can tell, typical of that tree. So you're not kind of going, oh, like these are the most extreme ones. You're going, okay, these all look to be about, like if I'm imagining how this apple wants to grow, this is how it wants to grow. So you collect 10 of them. And that might seem like a lot, but the reason is because a lot of features of apples vary even if they are the same variety. So shape can be different, color can be different, stems can be different. Even the interior of the apple, some of the things that, like the carpels and the calyx tube, can all be slightly different. So you want to kind of get enough that you can kind of look at 10 and go, okay, the calyx tube is in the shape of a funnel. The core lines meet. The stem is long. And again, maybe only 7 of the 10 the stem is long. You're kind of like, this seems like it's kind of a long stem. And part of the trick here is some things about apples, stem being a good example, vary all the time within an apple variety. So that is a terrible indicator. Like, you could never just be like, it has a long stem, I know what it is. Or a short stem. Because the same variety could have very different stems. We can skip through a couple. So, actually stay here. So, the first thing you realize about identifying an apple is that it comes from a flower. That's what grows into a fruit, into a piece of fruit. And in that sense, the fruit, this is kind of something that is actually, you should be thinking about it, that what we think of as the bottom of the apple is actually the top of the apple. So this is it in fruit form. And a lot of the terminology for apples actually come from botany. So basically the parts of the flower are terms we use in terms of the parts of the apple. And in order to investigate an apple, you have to kind of look at an apple from several perspectives, but the two most typical ones are, you've got to look at it kind of from like the top down, both literally both sides, but then also cutting in half that way, because there is information like this that's useful, and then also a lateral cut like this, in order to see kind of, these are called core lines, the core, calyx tube, etc., and kind of get the information you need. So, first thing you should start with, this is in no particular order, it's more that, one of the things you can do exterior and then going to the interior is you would start with the color. Or the skin, I should say, not even just color, but skin. And so, I'm not going to go into all these, but basically, skin can vary in a lot of ways. It can vary in texture, it can vary in color. Apples generally have what's called a ground coat, which is its kind of base color, which usually develops pretty early in its fruit life. And then it has a blush or striping that kind of overlays the base color. So you might say, okay, well this apple has a yellow base color and it seems to have some red striping. And I'm looking, and I'm also looking to see, what kind of striping. Is it kind of streaky? Is it kind of more dense and overlaying? I might look, this is called blush. So some apples do not have stripes. This is an example of a blushy apple. It just kind of, it's a yellow apple and then this part is kind of orange. That's blush. There's no stripes here. Actually, sorry, let's go back. I missed it. All right, so the other thing you look at is the actual, you'll see dots on an apple. Those are called lenticels. Lenticels are how the fruit actually interact with oxygen. And they can be a good clue. So they can be very inconspicuous sometimes, like this apple, even with the new lighting, I can't see it. Other apples have big, kind of russeted, which is this brown stuff, dots. So that's a good clue. Oh, okay, that's noticeable. And the dots themselves can be star-shaped. They can be they have a halo around them sometimes. And so all these things are clues of the skin. So now I felt it. This is a smooth apple. Again, stripy, yellow base, red stripes, streaking stripes. Lenticels are almost non-existent. I mean, yeah, they're very hard to see. Very rarely there could be like a telltale visual sign of the apple. So for example, Tolman Sweet is an apple that was historically grown in Maine quite a bit, and it can get what's called a suture line, which is this like colored line that runs down the side of the skin. So sometimes something like that will appear and you're like, oh, I feel really good about this one. That's pretty odd. That's incredibly rare for that to happen. So, okay, you've looked at skin. Next thing is, well, what's the shape? And again, you're thinking about this not what is this apple shape, but if I were to average together the shapes of my 10 apples, what's the shape? And there's all sorts of kind of base shapes of apples. They can be kind of round, they can be oblate, which is a pretty typical apple. So they're kind of flat, they look like they're smushed like this. They can be conic, that's kind of the classic, like Red Delicious, so they kind of like taper at the end. They can be ovate, where they kind of, they're slightly like an egg, but there's still some tapering. And then you can think about the angle of the fruit. And this is usually easier to see and cut open. And then, once you learn all those terms like round oblate, you can start combining them. So there's like round conical apples and round oblong apples and roundish oblate. And so you can kind of hone in on what the shape is. Yes.
So I know the taxonomy has to take up at least a third of the thing, but can we go from a why perspective on if your obsession with apples is great? Why is heritage so obsession worthy versus emergent genetics? And are the skills that you're honing here in this kind of heritage focus applicable to more emergent genetics quest?
Yeah, so I will say, a emergent genetics person who happens to dabble in historical identification. The way it is useful, though, is that describing an apple, I think, gives it, one, it helps you understand an apple. Like, even if it's your apple, so this is, I was explaining earlier, is likely a seedling. This precious apple is unique. And understanding it in all its glory is helpful to kind of like getting to know it. In terms of kind of some of these features, some of them are relevant to actually choosing your genetic thing. So for example, russeting, this apple has russeting, which is like this kind of like leathery exterior, can help ward off environmental pressures. So being able to kind of know like, ooh, russeting, that's something I'm actually looking for if I want to have an apple that might do well for 20 years in Maine, for example, and not be susceptible to other things. But it's true that a lot of this work is about looking backwards, as much as it might be useful to looking forwards in terms of building a new kind of apple culture, but is primarily a tool of history and analytical kind of time travel. This quickly, as I said, is you can cut the apple this way. The next one. And I'm not going to go through these, but just basically, actually, just kind of like every 5 seconds, just go there. So like, you can look at the stem, figure out if it's long or short. You can look at the cavity, which is the top of the apple. Is it wide? Is it narrow? You can look at the basin. So we're still kind of in the exterior of the apple. You can look at, pause here for a second, the carpels, which are the funny little remnants of the leaves at the bottom of the apple. Keep going. You can look to see what this is textured like, kind of what shape this makes at the bottom and the basin. You can figure out, again, cutting it sideways, where the seed cells are and how they all relate to each other. You can start looking at the carpels. The carpels are like the things the seeds live in are the carpels. And they have different shapes, and they appear in different parts of an apple. And they can be kind of high, kind of low. The carpels themselves can be spade-like, elliptical, etc., etc. So all of this stuff matters for identifying an apple. So it is pretty rare that you get to just go like, ooh, skin, shape, boom, got it, I know it. Instead, you might only figure it out by looking at carpels of 10 apples. I mean, like, oh, these are mostly spade-shaped. Oh, that means it's this particular variety. Now, the usefulness of this is also in part that a lot of our records of apples from the past, again, apple writing in the United States begins in 1817, and then really kicks off in the 1800s, is sometimes people writing about apples would have an image. They'd do like a very simple drawing of an apple kind of. But usually they had very detailed written descriptions of the apple. So they would actually say like, what did the carpel look like of this apple? And there's no visual. And so if you were backwards looking and going out and being like, well, I want to find this lost apple, but all I've got is this description, you've got to kind of use this visual material to, in a sense, engineer in your mind what this apple actually looks like. Because a lot of times, there's no visual provided, and as I said, without seeing the images, you're kind of at a loss. It's like, you rarely, and again, because you just can't go off if it's a big, stripy yellow apple to identify it. So, part of the purpose of the book as well is to kind of decode what are historical texts about lost varieties. Because otherwise they're just, a foreign language that is meaningless to most people, even people who are really interested in identifying identifying fruit. So we, for example, in the state of Maine, the Maine Heritage Orchard folks put up wanted posters of varieties we're looking for, and sometimes the wanted poster might have a very simple line drawing of an apple, but more often it just has a written description, like grown in Pembroke, last recorded in 1980, oblate, yellow apple, and then again maybe it tells me something about the basin being a certain size, and that'd be it. And so you'd have to be able to find that apple, actually decode what that all means. One interesting thing to keep in mind is there are plenty of things that make apples look different than they actually are. Usually disease pressures and fungal pressures, and also insects and other kind of things that screw up apples can kind of lead you astray in your detective work of identifying apples. So, for example, it can get a variety of divots like this. This could be apple maggot, probably. It can get kind of these like reddish purple spots, that's puncurlio. You can get this blackish soot on it, that's called sooty blotch. You can get this dotty stuff that's called fly speck. Those are not actually features of the apple. And so, the next one too. Part of learning to identify is also being able to figure out what disease, fungal thing is going on that is not typical of the apple, and it's something to be ignored in a sense, even though it might be very hard. Yeah.
I mean, given variable resistance, does it ever tell you something if it does have a disease? Like, oh, it's got that disease, it can't be such and such, or is that just esoteric?
The reason it doesn't really help us that much is that even the idea of intervening to prevent those things is a pretty modern construct. And so when people were writing about apples, let's say 1980, they weren't going, blah, 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 this is what the carpel looks like. Also, really resistant to cedar apple rust. And you're like, cool, like, I found this apple, and also I see cedars over here, and it's doing great. So it's just, in a sense, it's not as useful as it could be. That said, there are some varieties we know to be very susceptible to certain things. So, for example, Macintosh is very susceptible to apple scab. And therefore, it is not uncommon to find Macintosh that are very scabby. And it would be like, okay, well, this actually leads to me thinking it might be a Macintosh. Macintosh is an interesting kind of case study of an apple because really it did not take off in Maine until after 1934. Our number one apple in Maine, which I think this might be, is Baldwin. Was Baldwin for 150 years, which is a Massachusetts apple, very hardy, multi-purpose. Store it, you can eat fresh, you can cook it. But in the test winter of 1933-34, something on the order of a couple million Baldwin trees died. Basically, it was a very warm fall, and all the trees were kind of overproducing and very happy, and then the temperature in November dropped historically low, and there's stories that people actually, this wouldn't be apple trees necessarily, but going out of the woods and hearing trees exploding, because literally they filled up with moisture, and then the temperature dropped, they froze, and they blew up. So people were like, well shoot, all our Baldwin trees died, we need to choose an apple that's hardier than that. And they chose Macintosh. The problem with Macintosh was, it gets apple scab. But by the 1930s, people were starting to spray to prevent apple scab. So they can manage the apple scab and have a hardier apple. But that's why, for example, Macintosh, if you find it out in the wild, it's usually a tree that probably wasn't, occasionally it's really old, but it's usually a tree that's probably like 90 years ago, not 150 years ago. Whereas like a Baldwin tree is something you probably see that's 100 years old and not 50 years old. So it's funny that I have William here, who actually did photography for the second book. William and Ryan are on my fun foraging adventure. But the last part of the book, which I won't go into in too much detail, is photographs and anatomical descriptions of kind of the 34 most common varieties you would see in a historical orchard. So these are just ones that were really popular in New England. They may have been imported to be grown here. They may have been apples from Massachusetts. They may have been apples that came from New York that are just very common. And again, sometimes it's really obvious. Sometimes you get to know, this is Alexander, for example. You get to know Alexander really well, and maybe someone brings you an apple and you go, oh, that's Alexander. So for Alexander, for example, it's huge, usually. And it kind of tapers down to a kind of, the bottom of it looks like a red delicious, so it has that crowning, kind of funny bottom. And it kind of looks silly. It's like trying to balance on this like little kind of foundation. And it has a very long stem, which I know I told you should always ignore, but it does have usually a really long stem. And you can see it's kind of angular, so it kind of has sides to it as opposed to being just kind of circular. And so, as you can see, thank you, Molly, photographed the apple not only exterior, which is important, but also these interior features. So you can actually, again, if you think you have an Alexander, you can cut open and go, oh, maybe it is, and let me look at it compared to that and these, and try to figure out those characteristics are correct. All right, so that's the end of my talk. Other questions, but how do I identify apples? Any other questions?
Oh yeah, we have lots of questions.
Yeah, shoot.
Well, that apple that Jim brought you was from the Leighton homestead, and this is obviously Leighton Point, and so that was where the Leightons landed, drifting from the wind from Eastport, presumably, and it's a nice, gentle approach to the land there, so that to be a super old homestead. And potentially, it's also now part of a conservation program for Washington County, this Cobscook Shores, where presumably we could acculturate that organization to want to continue culturing apples as part of their, conservation mission, if we were to potentially make a presentation to them. But what are you looking at when you come to Washington County that's unique to here? Or what do you see as our unique potential here? Or which heritage apples do you see predominating here?
Yeah, those all great questions. I'll start with the what is here. We have records, actually pretty good records of Washington County in terms of where old farms were, and some records of what was grown on those farms. A lot of them would be the things that are in my book in terms of being common heirloom varieties. What is of particular interest in terms of identifying and studying, by which I mean also genetically testing apples, is apples known to be of very, very old homesteads that kind of predate us as a state. Because in the genetic work that's being done, we're able to kind of figure out a family tree of sorts for apples. But we have a ton of missing pieces. We know that, for example, people from Europe brought seeds of their favorite varieties, which are often storage apples. Renette Franche being the biggest one. There were a bunch of other French, usually French, a lot of French apples actually, and some English apples that came here, or seeds of those apples came here. And then there's kind of a generation of apples that came into existence probably in the 1600s, 1700s. And then most of the apples we're familiar with, except for some exceptions, are kids of those apples. So we have like a generation of apples we can only identify in our data set as being an unknown apple, unknown founder. And there's something like 60 of them. So we know kind of like the European apples, because maybe those are still growing. Then we have a gap, and then we have kids of these apples. And sometimes that can tell us a clue about what this apple might look like. But a lot of the genetic testing in the state is focusing on old homesteads to be able to see if there's those missing pieces. So for example, there's an apple that in the data set has been identified as unknown founder 13. Very sexy name. And we know it was a French apple. We didn't know where it was grown. We just know that we have lots of kids of unknown founder 13. And what we came to find is that unknown founder 13 was actually growing at the mouth of the Penobscot in an old orchard as of a year ago. So we found it. So basically we sent a leaf in, they tested it, and boom, that was unknown founder 13. So still existing in Maine. We never knew it was even growing in Maine. And was the only tree ever identified so far in the United States of it growing. But was in this area, that area of Maine, settlement, particularly of like trading in that area would have been 1640, so like So coastal areas, islands, particularly are areas where people may have been cultivating really kind of historically significant apples that we kind of don't know what they are. And there may still be genetics left. And honestly, in areas that were heavily farmed, and then when people kind of abandon those farms, is where those trees are likely to still remain. Because obviously, you put in a subdivision, you just wipe out all the trees. And if you keep farming, you might, again, just kind of update your orchard to be new apples. So a lot of these trees could still exist in old kind of homestead type situations, particularly dating back to the 1700s, 1600s is what we're kind of like looking to test. Now again, some of those might go and be like, well, some of those are see things and maybe not that important. But it is possible that some of these kind of foundational apples in the United States are still being grown places on the East Coast, like here. And so that's a major focus.
So abandonment is actually a great context for finding these founder apples.
Yeah, in part because it means that the trees got to just kind of go dormant and hang out. Now, unknown founder 13, they did not find a tree from the 1600s. Someone cultivated this apple through to the late 1800s, and then it was abandoned. So it was a useful enough apple to this farmer to keep it going to a point where then kind of their orchard stopped being part of their production, or kind of maybe the farm was left fallow and that was it. But no, certainly old homesteads that for at least 100 or more years has really not been developed are oftentimes kind of fertile ground for finding these historic things. The other reason I come here, which is very different than this, is you live in a very genetically interesting place when it comes to apples. So, and this is kind of an accident of history, but in about 1930-ish, this guy Radcliffe Pike, here are the Pikelands, up in way back, set up shop up in the Pikelands, which is on one of the fingers that goes in the Bay of Fundy, and brought back with him, he was a professor I believe, brought back with him from Kazakhstan a bunch of wild apples. So seeds of apples growing in Kazakhstan, which is the birthplace of modern apples, cinewood, etc., and just kind of planted everything and grafted some things and just kind of like put it out there experimentally, and then started managing it. And what happened is deer and other animals, would eat the apples, and they would go poop somewhere, and they would fertilize into an apple tree. And so within, I think the farthest I'd say is probably about kind of a 10-mile radius, maybe 15-mile radius around these pikelands, is a lot of weird apples that are related not to our modern apple called Malus domestica, which is kind of a mix of what's called Malus subversii, which is the apple from Kazakhstan, and Malus sylvestris and a couple of other European species of apples created our current eating apple. But this is kind of more of a direct relationship right to Malus subversii from Kazakhstan. So there are likely, a lot of them are likely crosses of domestic apples, so people obviously here have been growing apples for hundreds of years. And so there's pollen coming from, let's say, a Baldwin tree, and then it's, pollinating a flower from one of these weird trees, and then the seed coming out of it is this weird apple. So there's all sorts of oddities. For example, there's lots of crab apples. So crab apples means an apple that's about 2 inches in diameter or less. That is not a feature that is typical of Malus domestica. In fact, it's something that was kind of bred out of it, in the sense that both people and bears like bigger apples. Bears were the kind of primary mover of apples out of Kazakhstan. Birds too, but bears play a really big role. So when you see a crab apple in normal settings, it might be an ornamental tree, meaning it's a crabbing species that someone selected solely because the flowers are beautiful. It could be because it came out of a breeding program where they wanted to create a crab apple, and the way they did that was by actually going to Kazakhstan and getting seeds and planting them and cross-pollinating. But around here, there are all sorts of weird crabs that, full-grown trees trees, definitely seedling trees, producing these crab apples that have strange flavors, that have really weird shapes. You don't happen to have an egg apple on your do you? So for example, there's an apple growing in Edmonds that's like an egg. It has no cavity, just kind of like the stem just like shoots out of the top of an egg, and there's no basin. It just kind of like is a circle. That does not. That's just so weird. If you actually go to the Pikelands, there's all sorts of apple trees you would never identify as an apple tree. They're like bushes, basically. And again, that's this Malsiversii stuff that gave birth to all these weird apples. So part of my interest is actually documenting the weird ones that are not grafted trees, that are not related to our historical apples, but are actually strange new creations of cross-pollinating between these wild apples and the apples that were here in Washington County for a long time. Yeah.
Do you see much value for the new genetics for cider makers in the early apples? Like, I mean, I always, the yellow transparent and the red astrakhan, they go mushy so fast, but, I've been collecting apples around here for probably 20 years, and 50% are early apples. I know it's too late to get them, but are they worth anything for the cider industry?
No, sadly. So part of that, there is a reason for that. It might be a strange one. I think part of the reason a lot of early apples have survived is actually because of people vacationing up here. So I think there was some value in keeping trees around that you could pick before you left to go back to Massachusetts. And some people valued these early apples. And yeah, it was like you have a camp and you have an apple tree and you're like, oh, I'll keep it. You can pick it and make a pie before you go. They're not high enough in sugar. So people actually in Maine, I mean, Angus was just here. He's made some early season cider. And the problem is the first thing to really develop in apples is the malic acid. And the second thing to develop is the starch turning into sugar. And early apples are water, which is the primary ingredient in apples, and malic acid, and a little bit of sugar. And so when you ferment them, you get acid. And so they're not as valuable. And also that softness is actually something you want to avoid in cider making generally. In the sense you actually want slightly dry apples. It's not because they actually don't have any juice to them, it's that the cell structures are holding the juice better, so that when you press them, the juice is not splattering. And so that's actually a good feature of cider apples. And early apples, as you said, are just like balloons of juice. And so pressing them is actually kind of a big experiment of exploding apples.
So Sean, where would you place Macintosh in that spectrum of, like a typical Macintosh ripens like mid-September, or is that still considered early? Or
I think it's through what lens you're looking at it. So certainly in terms of just kind of like, so apples in Maine start ripening. Yellow transparents are earliest cultivar that ripens in Maine. I guess Lodi, but that's a more modern apple. So let's see, yellow transparent's been grown here since, I think we brought it over, the USDA brought it over I think in 1870. And it took off, it is a Russian apple that the USDA imported because it was thought to be cold hardy from Russia, which grew up here, Maine, and it was very widely grafted across Maine. And if you see a yellow apple ripening in like the first 2 weeks in August, it is often yellow transparent. Kind of at the tail end of each season, either at the very beginning of apple season or the very end, the types of apples that could be lessens quite a bit. And so that's actually easier to identify. Someone's like, I have this ripe, super ripe yellow apple on August 10th. It's like, okay, well, that's probably yellow transparent. Even though there could be other yellow apples. Same thing at the very tail end. If I had this thing that just hangs in the tree forever, it might be wine sap or black Oxford or Baldwin, which kind of, or Ben Davis, that just kind of like exist forever. So in the context of like eating apples, Macintosh would be not an early apple. It's kind of like a middle of the season apple. In terms of cider making, I think it is, in my opinion, it is an early apple. In the sense that it has sugar, but it's not that much sugar. And the acid content is so high, that's why it tastes so good. That it still does not get to that place where you're like, yes, I get to ferment this and get this alcohol I want, and and not have the acid roll.
I must say, I've had some good Macintosh ciders. I've had good like early season apple creations. Like I took apples that are similar to yellow transparent, just like early golden apples, and like blending them with peaches, and that's made like beautiful early season ferments.
Yeah, and that's a good point. So one of the ways you could try to use early apples better is really trying to kind of say balance them out, but again, find something dynamic in terms of fruit that would work well. And it's also really interesting because apples we think of as early and kind of not that useful if grown in other parts of the country are quite wonderful. So for example, in Wyoming they grow Macintosh, and I've had Macintosh cider from there, and it's phenomenal. It's just kind of grows differently in Wyoming than it does in New England.
I had a sort of similar or a different question, but related to other places. So I live in New Mexico, and we have a lot of acres of apple orchards there, and I think probably some old varieties that came in with very early settlement. And if you have gone and done this type of work in other places or there, or people who are looking at that, like I know there's one group that's in sort of the Four Corners area.
Montezuma folks.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is sadly not enough of us. I think if you look at it nationally, there's probably about a dozen, and that'd be generous. Which is too bad, because obviously, as you said, like there are all of these regions that were settled at different times, often settled a long time ago, could have exactly what we're looking for, and no one's looking. And what's tricky is, how long apple trees will live varies a lot about where they're growing. And so, if it's growing in Washington State, which is essentially in part a desert, but also like has relatively good irrigation, apple trees can live a really long time. A pure desert, or even just like really, I know in the Montezuma area, like the trees are like 100 years old. It's kind of like where they top out. In New England, 150 is like amazing. So that's the other piece too, is you're kind of racing against time to identify. And one of the hard truths of kind of identifying apples is the best resource is people. And generationally, when some people, so for example, John Bunker in Maine, this guy named Lee Calhoun in North Carolina, Virginia, when they started doing this in the 70s, there were still people alive who could tell you what that tree was and say, yeah, like that's my family's apple, that's this apple, that's what we've always called it, and you can then actually talk to them and they can confirm something that maybe again you anatomically describe the apple, but you've also got this person telling you that that's what it is. And that generation has mostly been lost, and so unless we find written records of these things, we're more into just simply genetic testing, describing it, and we're kind of missing that human piece that would have really helped in an area, especially an underexplored area, where you can simply stop by someone's house and be like, I see this apple tree, and they'd be like, oh yeah, that's whatever. Rome was a very popular apple in the Southwest. And you'd be like, oh, okay, cool, it's a Rome tree. And so that piece now is gone. Most gone.
So when you're looking for new genetics for cider and you're out there, what would be the most interesting texture, taste when you bite into it?
Yeah, totally. So as I said, part of my fall is foraging for cider makers. And I'm looking for one type of apple predominantly and then kind of a secondary. So apples, as I said, are mostly water, sugar, and acid. And when you ferment an apple that has water, sugar, and acid, and the sugar goes away, you're left off with acid, and not much else. And sometimes acid is really expressive and interesting, and other times it's kind of like feels like it's tearing at your like teeth enamel. So to create a drink that is more interesting on your palate, you need something to cause the drink to hang out in your mouth a little more. And so what you're generally looking for is something that will create, or the chemical compound are called polyphenols, and they're basically a type of acid. Although they're a type of acid, the way they manifest themselves when you eat a fresh apple is in terms of bitterness. So coffee over steep. Coffee is a good example. It's pure bitterness, and astringency, which is that kind of cotton mouthy feeling of losing, even though you know there's liquid in your mouth, you somehow can't swallow. So that'd be like oversteeped tea is really destructive. And so that in a fresh apple is actually an indicator of these polyphenols. And these polyphenols translate when fermented to be tannin and create literally that structure in the apple juice itself is what allows it to kind of hang on your palate longer, and you can kind of see nuances in it, and allows you to enjoy it much more than popping back just like in acid. So what I am looking for, because acid is the #1 compound in apples, is apples that are bitter and that are sweet and have very little to no acidity at all. And I would say that I find one out of every 150 apples I try, 200 apples I try. Bitterness is not a normal compound in apples. It's pretty rare, and I'm literally tasting a couple hundred apples. So I'm like, oh, there it is. That's what I'm primarily looking for. What also means good cider, there are what are called bitter sharps. Because cider does need acid, and so a bitter sharp would be acid, sugar, and bitterness, which you can often ferment by themselves, and they have all the components you need. But because, again, most cider makers, particularly in Maine, are blending bitter apples with other apples they use to generate volume, I tried almost exclusively to try to find bittersweet apples. And honestly, in the wild, no one really. So when people made cider like 150 years ago, they just kind of fermented what they had. But they weren't like, oh, I made a lot of polyphenol content and tannin in my cider. They were just like, I don't know, we have a lot of apples this year, let's ferment them and drink it. And it would be low alcohol, and they would ferment fast or slow, or turn into vinegar. It would be what it was. So no one, if I go to old orchards, unless I'm identifying stuff, I actually am probably not looking for old trees. I'm looking for the seedlings of those trees that have these characteristics. Yeah.
So at the beginning you talked about how there wasn't sort of a unified vocabulary.
Yeah.
How do you go back? So you've got, I don't know, 30 apples in your portfolio?
34 are photographed. Yeah.
So, but can one go back and use apples of New York or those sorts of things? Is there enough crossover in the terminology that one can sort of expand one's range of apples you can identify by using some of them?
Yes.
Or is it just...
Yeah. So I would say that 90% of the vocabulary is the same between Apples of New York and a book by Bailey or someone else, is they were generally on the same page. Where things broke down were actually weirdly often about the carpels and the sepals, so the little like flowery things in the basin and also the interior of the apple. They kind of like went all different directions with the terms they used. And so a strange part of creating this book is kind of setting drawing a line in the sand and being like, this is what this is going to mean. Because no one's ever done that in the sense that it's a useful resource that actually kind of, from this point forward, could be a resource to say, well, this is what concave means for something, for example. Because it wasn't even they were disputing it. It was just they were kind of using the words slightly differently, and you read old descriptions and you're like, oh, that makes no sense in this context, but that's just how they were using it. And so part of the impetus to write the book was to establish a common vocabulary, hypothetically we could all use, even if it's imperfect and not the exact same as what someone in 1880 uses.
So then when you find this apple after eating 200 or 150 that meets your kind of cider quest characteristics, then do you collect seed from those and provide them to orchardists in far out, abandoned farmland places? Or
Yeah, so what I do is, if I find something great, I bring it to the annual pomological exhibition that happens in Massachusetts. So for the last it was interrupted by COVID, but this is the 5th year of the, I don't know if it has a name, it's just the pomological exhibition that happens in kind of like Central Mass. And at that exhibition, people bring whatever seedlings they found they think are interesting. Because they taste great, it could be because they look weird, it could be because they're really good so last year, from across the United States, there was about 150 submissions. And every year, every exhibition, there's a catalog name of the apples. And the person who runs it, Matt Kaminsky, who actually wrote the foreword for the book, anatomically describes all the apples, describes the potential uses, flavors, kind of whether you go for cider, etc. And out of that comes both people visiting the exhibition, which is open to the public for free, but also people submitting things and reading the catalog to then contact people to get sign wood of that thing that they found interesting. So for example, last year I found a tree in Lincolnville that just tasted strange. It tasted like papaya, and if you ever had a pawpaw, it was just like really tropical. And it was also seemed to be really disease resistant, and it was growing like this big bush with all this fruit. And so I brought it to the exhibition, and then over the winter I sent like 6 people sign wood of this apple that I have now named, and is now hypothetically going to be grown in another orchard and trialed, and people are going to use it to eat it, to ferment it, etc. So that's usually that's how this stuff goes from random seedling and loop back to new variety.
But it's still like in the 18th century, like apple freaks having little correspondence with each other.
Yeah.
On a micro scale. If you're thinking macro scale, like the phenomenology of the pikelands, that's now like created an inception event for Washington County to have emergent, self-directed, low input or zero input food food culture.
Yep.
So from going a little more in that fruit direction, how could we accompany what the apple wants in Washington County?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is so we talk about it in homology in terms of trialing things. So you've got a tree, as I said, my Lincolnville tree. It looks healthy. I can't talk to it. I can't figure out all the diseases and fungal pressures it's been exposed to, but it seems to be good. It's like 20 years old. It seems fine. And again, no human intervention at all, of any kind. So when thinking about what is going to come in terms of growing environment is going to be constantly changing, that's a pretty good indicator that maybe this thing is good. And the only way to figure it out is to grow it somewhere else. In fact, grow it several other places and see, does it still resist diseases? Maybe it's really susceptible to a disease that's really common in Vermont or something. It can't grow there. And that's going to be, and is currently undergoing in terms of sending out sign wood, a fairly laborious and time-consuming process of just waiting and seeing what might work. If it does work, then it is bringing it back. Well, I mean, it's really propagating it anywhere, but especially bringing it back to the place where it's from and thinking about it as a well-designed source of apples for a particular region that can be widely grown. And that does seem to survive many of the things that other apple trees are facing and succumbing to, whether it be diseases or, again, defoliation, all sorts of other things. So it's kind of locating it, trialing it, and then from there, kind of like what I said about Macintosh, people telling their friends and their friends and friends to grow.
Proclairing it as a VIP in the region, or MVP rather.
Yeah, because again, Mother Nature's doing all this work for us while right? Like it's killing trees that can't survive. The trees that are surviving are telling us a lot about its ability to survive, and we should listen to them and what they're telling us. It doesn't always work out. There have been plenty of folks who have found trees that they were really excited about, that they thought would be great, for example, for cider, and maybe the original tree and the original fruit was really bitter, and they're like, this is amazing, and then they go and grow it in an orchard, and it's like not bitter at all, and they're like, oh, what the hell? Or maybe, again, they grow it in the orchard, and suddenly something's wrong. But out of the 140, as I said, maybe 20 of those would be trialed. And again, if maybe only even 3 or 4 of those end up kind of surviving that process, that's still really good. Because these apples have not been sprayed, they've not been managed, and so that at least might mean they're just not going to keel over and die the next time we have a major weather event or something.
Do you think culture can be significant? I mean, I read that book by the guy that just wanted the ones that were untended.
Yeah.
Is that true in your opinion?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, again, you have, I mean, obviously the human impulse is to control these things and study them, and that's what the university programs do, is they're like, well, we're going to breed disease-resistant apples. And they've tried that, and basically the diseases have adapted, and those previously disease-resistant apples are now just kind of like normal apples that succumb to diseases. So, one thing I think that means is that we can't look at it in a stagnant way. It's not like we're going to figure this out tomorrow and then like just grow this apple forever. But it does mean we need to be constantly looking for new stuff that, again, the apples are just doing it themselves. They want to survive, and we should find the ones that are good survivors. That also taste good or are good for cider. And so, for example, in Maine, the running theory is somewhere around 2 to 3 million apple trees are growing in our state. Now, again, some of those might be cultivated, some of those might be ornamental, perhaps in a subdivision. That's a lot of genetic material, and that's a lot of things to test and see how it might work and see what's doing well and what's not. I mean, the sad truth is a lot of these apples historically growing, are not really set up to survive today. I don't think anyone would have selected Baldwin in 2024 as an apple to grow. It's really interesting kind of culturally in terms of our history in terms of this apple, but those trees are struggling. And yet you can drive down, roads around here and you're like, oh, that tree's great, that tree's doing great, that tree's doing great. And so that's maybe where we should be growing going forward.
Why don't we find Baldwin apples at the grocery store?
That's a great question. It's a little complicated in the sense that it's really a historical trend. So going back in Maine to, again, let's say early 1800s, people were just growing what they grew. So they weren't thinking, I'm going to grow a Baldwin, unless they were like a real apple nerd. They were mostly just planting seeds and growing them. In the late 1800s, people were selecting apples they thought were good, and then also there was a market, either local or national, not national, I guess East Coast, or international. So Maine, for example, used to ship a lot of apples to Europe. And it was profitable to do that, even though it was quite expensive. And the number one apple we shipped is an apple called Ben Davis, which is the worst tasting apple I've ever had in my life. It just has like no flavor.
Wait, have you tried a Red Delicious?
Yeah, no, worse than a Red Delicious, I swear. It's flavorless. It's crazy. They're really pretty. You could actually advance the slide, I think, by like 1 or 2, and see Ben Davis. Yeah, there's Ben Davis. Like, pretty apple. Like, it's kind of got this like big flaring, rusted at the cavity, and like, oh, it's really nice. But the reason Ben Davis was selected as a commodity, which was the major transition in apples, was because it was indestructible. So it's really hard, and it never really ripens, so it, I guess, stays fresh. And you could pack it in a barrel, and you could ship it to Europe on a boat. And it would get to Europe, and it still looked like a Ben Davis. And so what you see in the late 1800s is people are still growing their own apples, but there are local economies of apples. So people grow Baldwin, sell Baldwin, grow Ben Davis, and sell Ben Davis. So for example, Somerset County in western Maine used to run by rail apples to the coast and ship them off to Europe. And that was pretty profitable. What really changed was the railroad got to Washington State. And Washington State is really easy to grow apples at scale because climate-wise it's kind of perfect. Again, it's a lot of sun, it's relatively temperate climate, and it's not too wet. Apple trees don't really like to be that wet. And so once Washington State came online with things like Red Delicious, it was simply cheaper to ship Red Delicious from Washington State to the eastern market than it was to sell Ben Davis from Maine down to Boston or something. And so once that happened, all these small growers who had all these interesting apples just could not compete. And so the apples that ended up winning were apples that stored well, didn't really bruise easily, and were really just commodity crops. So Red Delicious is a great example. And so that swallowed up a lot of these small-scale growers who could not compete. And so all you have remaining often are trees that were not these small-scale operations, but rather were the home growers who preserved a Baldwin tree. But that was the big market driving force in terms of what apples were available, and then it also worked the concept of seasonality. So if Red Delicious kind of stay on a shelf forever for a very long time, and so do I want to be restocking my shelf with yellow transparent in August, and then Macintosh in September, and Baldwin in October, or do I just buy a pallet of Red Delicious and put it on the shelf and then I just walk away? And most supermarkets said, well, I'll just do that. So that's why.
But they taste terrible.
They taste terrible. I know, but they look pretty, and that's all that matters.
Well, how many varieties of Red Delicious are there? Isn't there like 50?
Yeah, so one thing I did not talk about, again, I talked about the idea you can plant a seed or you can graft a tree. And planting a seed is how you create a new variety. One thing that happens occasionally is what is called a sport, which is a really cool term for a bud mutation, meaning a single bud on a tree, for whatever reason, its genetics go a little screwy, and it grows differently. And that difference, this probably happens all the time, but we don't perceive it, because the difference is not something you can visually identify. But sometimes, for example, it might be red, or it might be russeted, or it might have higher sugar, etc. And so, once we transition to commodity growing of apples, a company called Stark Brothers, which was the primary nursery company in the country, was really pushing the idea that good apples are red. And so, the original Red Delicious was an apple called Hawkeye from Iowa. It was growing in 1876. It's kind of stripy and like a little green. And over time, so Stark Brothers are planting out hundreds of thousands of Red Delicious trees. And every so often there'd be a sport, and that's where we redder. And they would then market that redder one. And so you actually see nursery catalogs basically saying, that Red Delicious you sold you 5 years ago, and it'd be shown in the catalog as like yellow and kind of like ooh boo, and then the new one, the like super double red Red Delicious, was red. And again, it tasted better, or any other characteristic other than redder. And so over time, so what got grown is Red Delicious. We're on probably like thousands of sports of Red Delicious into Red Deliciousness that have all been selected mostly for their storage capacity and for their color, and for nothing else.
Any advice on scion taking? How to get that in the age of wood?
Yeah, so scion selection is it's hard to explain, but I'll say this: you only want last year's growth, always. And the way you identify that is you actually look to see. So you're looking at what looks to be young growth, and you're identifying growth that has a terminal bud, meaning there is a bud developed at the tip, and there's no buds on the side really developed at all. And you can run that back to what looks like a little knob of sorts, and that is your scion. That's your 1 year growth. And sometimes your 1 year growth might be a millimeter, and so you really can't collect scion wood. Other times, in a really precocious tree, it might be like 2 feet long. And you're like, great, okay, I'll make several pieces of scion. But basically, that's what you're doing. And what's hard is actually with a lot of these older varieties, particularly trees that have not been tended, is they might not throw off a lot of scion wood at all. And one way to actually get scion wood from some of these older varieties, maybe we want to test them or grow them, is to prune them. Because pruning tells the tree, shoot, I need more branches to get the light, to get the photosynthesis.
So you do that the year before.
Exactly. So and pruning is its whole own art involving a lot of kind of relationship with the tree in terms of you don't want to overdo it. But yeah, so pruning will tell the tree, I need to grow more, and so you might get more scion wood. And just by nature, some apple trees grow really slowly and produce very small pieces of scion wood, and others grow very successfully. But that's the process you're going through. So if there's something you really love and you're like, I can never find scion wood, I would try pruning it and seeing if that triggers more growth.
So what type of apple grows really well here on the coast that's really hardy, really disease resistant, and pretty good general tasting apple?
I don't know. In the sense that I actually think it's the apples you drive by here. You just gotta try them. I promise they don't taste that bad. But a a lot of historic varieties won't grow well here.
They would.
Will not grow well here. I mean, they might survive here in the sense there still are trees, but there aren't. Again, a lot of these older varieties if you're not actively spraying, it's why organic management of apples is really hard. Like if you're not actively intervening, they probably will not do well. And I can't tell you other than you're planting a lot of things to see what does well. But I'm also not kidding about, the apple over there, the apple tree over there that's producing fruit every year is doing well and is not succumbing to the diseases that are in the area. And to figure out if it's worthwhile, you just gotta taste it.
And then if you were gonna press from that apple all your cider and you have pumice full of seeds, and then you convince the land trust to let you spray your pumice on their land so that there'd be emergent a whole another generation of whoever comes up. That would be like very radical.
It would be. I mean, it's interesting because the fact that apple trees produce a crop with very little can produce a crop with very little human intervention is a very interesting kind of food systems issue, or possibility, and both in terms of like feeding the animal kingdom, but also us as part of the animal kingdom. Because, apple trees, again, they're not all going to survive, but some do, and especially around here, they do pretty well.
And the deer do really good at dispersal.
Yeah. I have mixed feelings about deer. I love that deer disperse apples. That's great. I've had at least a couple people tell me I cannot pick their apple tree because of the deer. Yeah, which I'm like, dude, or lady, there are 3 million apple trees in Maine. The deer are not going to starve. I swear to God. I will go find you Red Delicious. You can feed that deer the Red Delicious, and you can give me your bittersweet tree. That would be fine. But yeah, it is a funny oh, but the deer. What do you mean, but the deer? The deer are doing great. Anyways, that's my diatribe about beer.
Are all the varieties open source? I mean, have people patented apple varieties, or basically
Yeah, great question. 95% are open source. I mean, because again, in a sense, it's almost impossible to stop them. So again, if all I have to do is cut off new growth to replicate a tree, it's really hard to stop. And in fact, one of the really fun things the Stark brothers did, these evil nurserymen, is they started caging apples trees. So for example, the first Golden Delicious they put in a cage because they didn't want to prevent anyone from just kind of going over and snipping a piece of cyanide. So they literally had an armed guard in front of the Golden Delicious tree in West Virginia, making sure that no one stole it. But the funny thing is, again, so you get the cyanide though, and you grow it. I mean, there's nothing stopping you from being like, oh, here's some cyanide, here's some cyanide. So it was very silly. And in that sense, I can tell you that there are some varieties that are very highly controlled. They're almost all created by universities. They're almost always grown by orchards that have a contractual relationship with the universities to grow for a certain number of years. And outside of that, everything else is just fruit game. And those are apples like, if you've heard of Cosmic Crisp, which is the crispiest crisp apple, or a lot of the ones you might find in a supermarket that are not Granny Smith or Red Delicious, a lot of those are contractually bound. The orchards basically are in a position where they can be legally liable if anyone starts growing it elsewhere. But the good news is most of those apples suck. So the good ones, that's not true.
What do you think of Liberty apples?
It's fine. It's very pretty. It's kind of purpley, which is nice. So New York Agricultural Station bred those apples. New York Agricultural Station bred Liberty and Freedom and all sorts of other American names. And they're meant to be slightly disease resistant, and they're meant to be easy to grow without a lot of intervention. But I don't think they taste very well, and they're not really.
Right. I got it because of the disease resistant, and I don't think they taste that great.
No, they're kind of watery, and you're like, oh, it's an apple.
How about Honeycrisp?
Honeycrisp is actually very disease prone. There's all sorts of fungal pressures that really screw up Honeycrisp, and it's actually really hard to manage as an orchard.
I was thinking more of taste.
I think the obsession with crispy, watery, sugary apples is
So I can tell him he has bad taste.
exactly. You should, yeah, you should be like scolding them about the apples. Yes.
Give him Black Oxford.
Right. Any other questions before I depart? All right. Thank you all.
The pre-order your book?
Yeah. So I'll give you a card. So at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, I'm gonna press launch on my Kickstarter page, and the way it's gonna work is by hosting me for sale for about 2.5 months, and then it'll not be for sale, and then we'll send it to print in the spring, and we'll ship it out in the spring. In part, in a way, this is. I'll show you the backstory of sorts. I live in a small house. I don't want boxes of books at my house, and so this allows me to print books to demand of who orders it, as opposed to ordering 2,000 books and just hoping and praying that people buy it. But yes, I'll give you my card, and as of tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., 8 a.m., it'll redirect you directly to potentially buy it if you'd like, and that'd be great. Thank you all.